Everyone, and welcome to our special council meeting for June 16th, 2025. I'd look for a mover and a seconder to call the meeting to order at 6:02 p.m. Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. And I will call on Councillor Cressman for the territorial acknowledgement.
We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Métis and Inuit people, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community.
Thank you, Councillor. We have no additions to this evening's agenda, so the recommendation is that the agenda be adopted as presented for June 16th. May I have moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest this evening, councillors? Seeing none. I did want to quickly call forward announcements first, just for those watching online, because I wanted to make an exciting announcement that happened earlier today in Kitchener. The province of Ontario has granted Wilmot Township $379,650 to go towards our refrigeration unit at the Wilmot Recreation Complex. So a huge thank you to Director Catania and his staff who put forward that application that proved to be successful, and thank you to all of our staff that were involved, as well as we did have a chance to have the minister come out and see the facility today. So thank you to everyone involved, and huge congratulations to the township. It's very exciting, especially for the budget line. So just wanted to announce that while we have everyone still viewing online, hopefully, because I know sometimes by the time we get to announcements, not everybody's still on. But with that, I will now go into our regularly scheduled agenda onto presentations. So this evening is just two education sessions. The second one coming up is actually the finance component, and that was a result out of our budget process of council passing a motion on wanting to receive more budget education, general finance, not explicit to the 2026 budget, so just for clarity on that. And our fire chief also asked if he was able to present on some important fire information, so we have both of those presentations this evening, and I will invite our fire chief, Rod Leeson, to facilitate the fire services education component of tonight.
My technology working. Thank you, Mayor Solomon, and through the chair, thank you to council and Madam Mayor for allowing me to do this presentation tonight. I just wanted to share some information as we build up to our next budget cycle and sort of build that layer by layer as we go through all of this. So tonight we're going to talk about the OFM. In particular, their mandatory certifications, regulations, and responsibilities that apply to the council and the municipality and myself, of course. The establishing and regulating bylaw and how it fits into the overall piece. The community risk assessment, fire master plan, fire underwriters presentation, fire prevention, public education, and then I'll follow up with emergency management at the end. So we'll dive right into it. So the OFM is the overall responsible governing body that looks after fire services throughout the province of Ontario. And they use two pieces of legislation to really deliver those programs to our communities through council and the fire chief. And that's the Fire Protection and Prevention Act and then the fire code itself. And I will, as a side note, the fire code has just been updated. You may recall recently the Ontario Building Code was harmonized with the National Building Code, and they're doing a lot more of that. And the fire code is going through that same evolution with the National Fire Code. And then they also have to get in line with the Ontario Building Code in some areas so that we're talking on the same page. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Other regulations that are under their watch are firefighter safety, community risk assessments, mandatory inspections, fire drills, and vulnerable occupancies. Excuse me, as they work through that. They also provide advice and assistance. We are constantly in touch with our advisor. When we get into something that's a little outside of our scope, we'll educate ourselves and become more in line with that legislation and how it applies to that particular property or individual as it may be. They do reviews under the affected orders under the FPPA. If someone wants to appeal something, there's a body that will allow for appeals. They administer the provincial emergency systems that go through which is the mutual aid program throughout the province. And they conduct fire investigations. They maintain fire-related stats. Applied research being maybe there's a recall on an appliance. That may be the result of multiple fires that were caused by something, that they would bring in some experts and they would do forensic studies on those type of things. And then, of course, training and certification of firefighters. Mandatory certification began its process in July of 2022. It was announced then to the province that all firefighters in the province of Ontario have to meet some level of certification by July 1st of 2026. That was a lot of scrambling to determine what the legislation looked like and how that applied to our fire department in Wilmot. At that time, all of the townships and the cities all made their decisions in our region, and we have aligned ourselves to be a full interior attack fire department with all of the requirements and training that goes along with that. We also are hazmat operations trained. We are not technicians, and I'll talk a little bit about more of that standard on the next slide. The job performance requirements are done through the NFPA standards. There's a level 1 and 2 for firefighter certification, and a whole variety of others that apply to the other specialized rescues and the technical rescue pieces. Yes.
Do we say through you, Mayor Salonen, for presentations like this? I guess, well, anyway, through you, Sir Mayor Salonen, are you looking for questions along the way, or do you want just questions at the end?
I think in the interest of time, because I'm trying to squeeze a 4-hour presentation into 45 minutes, if we could wait to the end, that would be appreciated, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at that time. Thank you. Anyway, NFPA 1072 is the standard that we use for hazardous materials ops. And then when we get into the technical rescue standards, we have till July 1st, 2028 to meet those requirements. And that would include our surface water rescue, flood water rescue, and our ice water rescue, along with auto extrication, both Chapter 8 and 9. And again, these are all come out of the NFPA standards. Our job performance requirements are gathered out of those standards, and then we apply that through the training. It's been a lot of hard work. Our firefighters have worked really hard and put a lot of extra time in to meet these achievements and write exams, and they also have to do practical testing. So they would have to, excuse me, the process is that they arrive at the testing, they write the test, then they go out to the fire ground, and then there's an envelope opened, and a proctor from the fire college, from the OFM, pulls out some skills, and we don't know what they are. They're just random. They pull the skill out, and they'll say, I want you to take that 20-foot extension ladder, and I want you to raise it to that window, or I want you to roll hose, or I want you to do this or that. So that's kind of how it works. We are at about 98% with our firefighters to be level 1 certified. Level 1 and 2 certified, that is. And then we have over 50% are pump op certified as well. That's an important benchmark, and we have about, at the end of this year, we'll be around 26 people left to certify down into the recruit ranks. So we're in really good shape in that respect. And we're also about 98% with our hazmat ops certification. So we're on track also to have our specialized rescues in place by July 1st, 2028, but we still have a lot of work to do yet. And we'll need a lot of support from council to achieve that goal. So getting into the regulations and responsibilities, in the Act, it says that a council of the municipality can establish a fire department. And I'm not going to read all this verbatim, but we'll just cover the main points. And if we establish a fire department, then the fire department has to provide fire suppression services, and it can provide other fire protection services as this council sees fit. Now, we have an established, mature fire department, so it's not like we're just opening up the doors tomorrow and we're going to establish a fire department. So basically, this council has accepted that the fire department operates the way that the establishing and regulating bylaw has outlined. Subject to these sections, you can also establish more than one fire department if you wish. I don't know why we would do that, but there may be circumstances in some municipalities where that would be a requirement. And if you establish a fire department, you have to have a fire chief. And once you have that fire chief is then given certain powers through the Act, through council, to administer the fire service within the township or municipality. And more importantly, the fire chief is ultimately responsible to council. So we have a reporting structure in the township that the fire chief reports to the CAO, up to council. But if something ever happened where the fire chief felt there was something amiss, the fire chief has the authority through the Act to go directly to the mayor and speak to the mayor about some issues that may have to come directly to council. So that is in the Act, and that lies there. I've never experienced that and hope never to, but it is there just in case. Because public safety is so important, we don't want that to ever be compromised. The responsibility of council is to establish public education, fire prevention programs, and of course, suppression programs, etc. And the fire chief typically develops those programs, comes back to council, presents that to council for approval, and then the fire chief, once has approval, goes back to the community and delivers those services. The other services that are, fire suppression, fire prevention, public education, the way we talk about these are the three lines of defense that we typically talk about. Typically, it's public education, fire prevention, and then fire suppression is the third line. We always want to try to prevent the fire before it actually happens, if we can. Mitigation and prevention of risk for carbon monoxide, and we were to require public safety education on that as well. Rescue and emergency services, that would be us going to the hydro cut to rescue somebody that's wiped out on their bike or, excuse me, a motor vehicle collision, something of that nature. Communication, we have to communicate public safety messaging throughout the community. We have to train our people to the appropriate level of service and provide them the necessary equipment, tools, and resources to deliver those services. And then it says all services from basically A to E have to be included as you build on that ladder of services. Municipalities are also responsible for developing and passing other bylaws, some of which are mentioned. So the fire chief is hired under bylaw. That's a bylaw that council has already approved. Fire road access, which we went through that process a few years ago. Open air burning, which we did a few years ago, updated that. Regulating fire prevention, etc. Fees for service, which we have a really strong fee for service bylaw where we can recover costs and implement various fees where required. And then, of course, the provisions for safe handling and storage of and sale of fireworks, not to be confused with the fireworks bylaw. The establishing and regulating bylaw is an incredibly powerful policy that council approves through the fire chief. So the fire chief typically develops that E&R bylaw, presents it to council. Council then has an opportunity to ask questions about that document, and then once approved, that document is what guides the fire chief to deliver fire protection services in the community, and that has everything to do with fire prevention, public education, fire suppression, auto-X, training, equipment, tools, resources, the whole sphere of what happens within the community as we work through that. It's, as mentioned, it's a policy framework, and I think if you remember back, we talked about how policies protect council's liability, and they're extremely important that we have those effective documents in place. It also delivers, it It spells out the obligations that the municipality will make to the community and how we'll deliver those services. It provides that legal basis. It gives you flexibility. Council decides and determines what levels of service are delivered to the community. And this document allows you to open it up if you need to, and you can change those levels of service according to the community's needs and circumstances. The best example I can give you is sometime down the road, if the community grew large enough and required a full-time fire department or a full-time day shift to move to a composite fire department, you would open that document, add in those elements to allow that to happen, and then that again, once that document is approved, that tells the fire chief, okay, this is how you're going to deliver that service to the community. And then it also ensures that we're compliant. We're meeting the training requirements, we're meeting the equipment requirements, we're using standards to determine what equipment to buy, and so on and so forth. And then we move on to the community risk assessment. So OREG 37818 is a mandatory regulation that required municipalities in 2019 to develop a community risk assessment so we could take an educated look at where are the risks in our community, how do they apply to the fire service, and again, what training, tools, equipment do we need to deliver those services to those pieces of the community where there may be higher risks and found in our community, or maybe not concentrating on the lower risk areas with some of the things that we may have done in the past, so we could rejig our service delivery model in that respect. Excuse me. It's really important that council understands how important this document is, because it plays back into the establishing and regulating bylaw. They're connected together. There's 9 profiles that we must look at, shall look at when we're delivering this. So we had this done by a third party in 2019, and it was approved then in 2020 by council at that time. And then it's been since looked at internally to give it another 5-year life, because nothing in the community at this point has really changed. There are some changes that are going to come, and we'll have to look at the document again at that time. But for now, we didn't really have to go any further with the document. So as you can see, it's geographic profiles, building stock, critical infrastructure, demographics, hazard profile. Then we get into public safety, response, community services, economic profile, and then we look at our past history. What's happened in the past can help determine what we may see in the future. And that's really helpful too, because our goal at the end of the day through public education and fire prevention is to try and lower the incidents, but we're never going to eliminate them. We just don't have those type of skills. Now the big document in the end is our fire master planning. So in 2019 we undertook a fire master plan to modernize the current plan that was in existence, and the third party did that same fire master plan, and we take that document back to council once it's completed, and council's involved, there's public engagement involved, fire department's involved, council directly is involved in the process as well. It's quite comprehensive. It takes quite a bit of time to go through it. It took us probably 9 months, 10 months to get through the document, and then we take it back to council to endorse the document. And through that process, we do strategic planning, community risk assessment is tied back into it, service level standards, we have action plans, 3 lines of defense, we cover that, we've talked about that before, resource allocation, everything from staffing, apparatus, equipment, fire stations, locations, how quickly can we get our people from the fire station to the incident, technology and innovation, and then of course community engagement, which is really, really important. We want the public to have a say in what they feel the fire department should look like in their community. What Fire Master Planning tries to achieve is improved efficiencies, effective service delivery. It gives us strategic decision making. We're not thinking with emotion, we're thinking with fact. We're looking at things, we stand back, we take that sphere of the community and look at it from a really factual based risk assessment. And then we have our community safety, and then it allows us to do strategic budgeting. It's a 10-year plan. We can take that 10-year plan and we can start allocating funds on an annual basis towards those benchmarks that have been identified. And all fire master plans have benchmarks or goals by years. Usually we do short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. And within those, we try to place dollars in those slots so that when we get to those benchmarks, there are some funds available to fund those particular outcomes. And this was the result of the Fire Master Plan in 2020, and you'll see that all of those things were put in place in 2020. Council approved the plan. They requested funding to be put in place for the plan. We developed some strategic thoughts about the station, and they actually moved it up to 7 years. So that would have put it in 2027 it was to be completed by. And then, of course, they requested that I find an alternative location for Station 3 should it become inundated with a flood. Where could we go in an emergency for a few days or whatever time it took? And I did achieve that as well very quickly thereafter. Fire Underwriter Survey, it's now called Verisk. They've been bought by a company in the U.S., so they're getting larger and starting to use some of the data out of the U.S. too that they use. But it's a very important company to work with and partner with in our community to make sure that we're getting the best possible insurance grading we can for our ratepayers so that they are realizing the least amount of money out of their pockets for insurance rates. So Fire Underwriter Survey goes around, they do a lot of data collection and analysis, and they have that from, they do lots of, GIS mapping, and they talk to the fire departments, they get information from us about a variety of things. That feeds into their grading system, which is a 1 to 5, and then they have another, the public fire protection classifications, which are 1 to 10, 1 being the best, 10 being the worst, 1 being the best, 5 being the worst. And then the insurers take all of that data, and it's really complicated because every insurer wants to accept a different level of risk as well. They may want to accept this much risk or that much risk. So they take that information and they determine their business model on how they want to provide risk in a community. And then the benefits, of course, the higher our grade, the lower the rates to the ratepayer. But you got to find that balance. If we put a full-time fire department in Wilmot, we'd get the best insurance rates, but that just doesn't make sense because it's the cost benefit's not there. So, you wouldn't, those are things you just would not do. So we try to find what is the best balance for our community given our current circumstances and equipment needs. Fire prevention and public education, this council thankfully has supported both a public educator and a fire prevention officer. Very important and integral to growing these programs in our community. There are a few things that we shall do. Routine inspections are covered under the ENR bylaw. They're important to make sure that we're doing cycle inspections in various locations. Some are mandatory. For example, long-term care homes, we are required to review their fire safety plan annually, and we have to do a drill with them and witness the drill every year. That's mandatory. So that takes quite a bit of preparation and time to go through that process, working with the stakeholders and making that come to fruition. Very cooperative group, works great, but it is a lot of work to get through that process. And then there's request and complaint, which is OREG 36513. That regulation requires us, we have no option. If somebody calls us and says, I would like you to inspect property X, then we have to do that. We have no option. If somebody calls in a complaint about a potential fire safety matter, we have no option but to go to that particular location and investigate whether or not it is in fact a real or not real fire safety matter. And we have to report it and document it, and it has to be in our RMS system, because if anybody disputes it, we can demonstrate then to the fire marshal's office and council that we did do our job, and here's the results of our inspection or our investigation or whatever the outcome of that particular event was. This gives you an idea of some of the fines that we can levy. So all fire prevention officers and the fire chief, we're provincial offense officers. We're not the police, but we have a similar job of a police officer. We have a ticket book just like a police officer. We don't write traffic tickets or any of those type of things, but we write failure to install a smoke alarm ticket if we chose to do so, if it was necessary. And then as you see down below, if we did a Part 3 information, which is then take someone to court, you can see fines for individuals can reach up to $100,000 in 1 year in prison. Then, of course, corporations, $1.5 million in 1 year in prison for the directors of that corporation. So it's very serious. There's extensive case law now using the fire code with a lot of positive convictions for people that were not following the code appropriately. Another job that the fire marshal's office does is they do public fire safety guidelines. So these PFSGs give us guiding frameworks to work with when we're developing policy within our township. These particular documents, some of them are very lengthy reads. Some of them are a little out of date. So we have to look at other resources like NFPA standards sometimes to find those that what most fits our community and our current situation. We have operational planning, which is a resource from deployment and risk. So how is our fire department deploying based on the risks that we have in our community? Do we have enough firefighters? Do we have enough fire apparatus? Do we have enough fire stations, et cetera? Those are the things that guide us through these various documents. And then our fire safety effectiveness model, and it uses these 8 pillars to assess the different risks and how we are getting to the impact of the fire at the end of that conversation. And all of those things build into our how are we doing? That's our measurements as we go through these things. So we use all of these all the time to measure our effectiveness as a fire department and how we deliver to the community. Excuse me. This is just a list of a bunch of the other PFSGs that are available to us, and that's not even the entire list. I just did a cut and paste to show you some of them, but there's extensive documentation out there that we refer to all the time so that we can keep in pace with what's going on in the market today. Building owners are responsible for their properties. This is really important. If you buy a 3-story walk-up apartment building with 30 apartments in it, you, the owner, is ultimately responsible for the fire safety and protection of that building. The fire code makes that very clear. We in Wilmot take a very collaborative approach. We always educate first before we start writing tickets or doing any of that stuff, unless it's something really serious. We write orders. Orders are intended to have people, persuade people to make the changes that are required. We can write orders with 3 days to comply, or we can write it for 30 days to comply. We can extend them. We can work with people. We try not to put financial burdens on people or undue hardship, but at the end of the day, the building has to be safe. So we always try to work with various stakeholders to make sure that we achieve that goal. Our interest in the safety of the buildings is it's proven that if the buildings are safe and the safety systems work, less lives are lost in those buildings. And in some cases, if the fire can be detected at an early stage, we can save that building from a great loss. We don't want those losses to happen in our community if we can avoid it. Inspection orders are provided both to the property owner. They're posted on the building in certain cases. If it's a tenanted building, then the tenants have to be aware of it. And we also we work very closely with our building department. Our chief building official is a very important piece of the fire department's puzzle. We work back and forth all the time. If we write orders on a property, it's a high probability that it's going to require a building permit to achieve making those amendments with the building. So we will provide a copy to the chief building official so they're aware of what's going on in the community, and then we work back and forth to make sure that building permits are issued. And then once the building permit is issued, then basically we step back until the permit requirements are satisfied, and then we can close our file as well. So that's kind of how that process works. We do follow-up inspections, tracking, documentation. We look at all our high risk. I mentioned the long-term care homes. There's mandatory requirements there. That's all tracked and documented each year so that we can have, at our fingertips, we can have those analytics available to us. We involve our suppression staff, our volunteers on evenings, or sometimes they'll go out in the weekends to do door-to-door smoke alarm checks. We have a process that they'll knock on the door. We have handouts. We don't go in the home, but we talk to the property owner to make sure, you know, did you know this? Did you know that? Educating people about smoke alarms, CO alarms, and, you know, have you done your home escape plan? Those are the three things that we always ask people to try to achieve. A lot of people don't realize that the hardwired smoke alarms in their homes have an expiry date. Some people still think they're a permanent fixture, and they are not. They have to be changed every 10 years. There's an expiry date on them. It's very, very important, because if they don't work, the consequences could be terrible. We identify any backlogs. Fire inspections are really lengthy when they start to finish. Some of them can last up to 2 years. They can take a very, very long time, especially if we do a general review commitment on a building through an architect. Those can be very lengthy. So it is quite a process. Communication and management of multiple alarms at the same property. So we have multiple alarms going on at a property, and they have fire alarm system malfunctions going on. We have to make sure that those get fixed in a timely manner, because if the real thing happens, we don't want things malfunctioning. So we'll follow up with those type of things. I already discussed that. We look at high-risk agricultural facilities when required, talking to our farming community, making sure that they're as safe as they can be as well. And there's new code regulations coming out on large-scale barns, so that'll be interesting to see how that plays in. And then we do photographs, building audits, fire safety plans, the whole 9 yards as we walk through all those processes. We also have 3 of our staff we're trained in fire cause and determination. We don't have a forensic lab, so at best we can find the area of origin, maybe the source of ignition, but typically origin and cause, or one of those companies, or maybe the fire marshal's office will come in to do the investigation and do the forensic side of it. But we are required to have those services in place, because we have to know when to protect evidence, when to protect the property, et cetera, et cetera. Fire safety plans are a mandatory requirement at certain properties. This basically lists most of them. Those fire safety plans are to be reviewed by the owner annually, and the people in the building that apply to them, there's training is required to be applied. We are required to sign off on the first iteration of the fire safety plan, and then if there's any changes to the property and it changes the fire safety plan, it has to come back to the fire department for approval. A fire safety plan is not approved until the fire chief or chief fire official has signed off on the document. Pre-planning is a very important exercise that fire departments go through, and with our records management system, we have a pre-planning module built right in that our firefighters will eventually be able to see on the way to the call, and it'll show them building layout, where services are, if there's anything dangerous in the building, where that's located, how to contact the building owner, et cetera, et cetera. NFPA standards have dictate a long checklist of items that we look for, and we apply that then to our pre-planning exercises as we go through that. And then finally, emergency management is through Emergency Management Ontario, is protect lives, property, and infrastructure in the faces of an emergency. It focuses on prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response, and then finally recovery. And under the EMCP, we are required as a municipality to have a plan, to have a CEMC, and then we also have to have training programs and exercises for staff and our control group, public education on an ongoing basis. And then at the end of the day, we have to do our HIRA and our critical infrastructure annually, along with the appendices in our plan. So there's a lot of administrative work that has to be done behind the scenes. The head of council, our mayor, would declare an emergency if it ever should happen, which we hope it never does. And then the head of council also would declare the emergency it's terminated at that time. The CEMC then prepares the documents. There are documents that have to go to the province to go through that process. And typically it's the CAO, the CEMC, and the mayor would collaborate on that decision. That's typically what happens, but the mayor has the ultimate authority to decide whether or not to do that. Emergency management is a shared responsibility through upper tier, lower tier province, So it's quite a intermix. There's NGOs mixed in that, along with various critical infrastructure operators. Talked about that. Yeah. And then, oops, talked about, I gotta get caught up here, shared responsibilities, and then, I'm the CEMC for the municipality. Donna Erb is our current alternate CEMC. We oversee the township program with a very small budget and limited time. It is somewhat of a side of the desk, but I think we do a pretty good job. We get our annual compliance in place, and we do our annual review, our tabletops. We have our control group meet, and I think we have a pretty good program going with some education every year. It works well for us in the current time. Closing remarks for me is this is your fire department. Council makes the decisions about how this fire department operates. I'm your steward. I work for you. I take your wishes and I apply that to the fire department. You take the front seat in protecting our community. You are the leaders. It's important that we all understand that role. I am your best resource if you want information about the fire department. I am your best resource at the end of the day. One thing that I always say to people that they don't really think about is not one volunteer firefighter that currently is employed by our township has to stay here. This does not pay their bills. And I just want you to understand they're here by choice. These women and men are dedicated to our community. They're amazing. They work hard. They put their time in. They're up at 3 in the morning running calls, and then they go home and they have to get up and go to work. And they do this day in and day out, and they never complain. They're amazing people. We're so lucky to have the team we have. I can't say enough good about our team. They're amazing. Preserving the model, the volunteer model here is essential. We have to continue to do that. It's really important, and I will strive, as long as I'm fire chief here, to continue to make our volunteer model work and function in our community. And we need your support. It's vital to the success of our fire department. We need your support as we continue to grow. As you know, there's growth coming, and that's going to have an impact on our service as well. Questions?
Through you, Mayor Salonen. So the one question I had when I was going to stop you earlier was just, it sounded like you were saying our firefighters are just as well trained as the firefighters that are full-time in the city. So I was just curious about that. Do you know the percentage? I mean, it sounds like quite a few of our firefighters have the same certification. I was just wondering about that comparison.
Yeah, no, it's good, great question. That is true. So a firefighter in a city, full-time department, is trained to the NFPA standard level 1 and 2 in hazmat ops, and so are we. So we have the same level of training. The nice thing about our training here is we've partnered with our 3 other townships, and we do the training in-house to try and economize so we're using the skills of our certified instructors. We've written curriculum and we've sent it to the province. They've approved our curriculum, and then we deliver that curriculum, and the exams and testing is all done through the province as well. But we deliver it in-house, saving our tax base quite a bit of money to get our firefighters at that level. So it's, yes, they are trained to that level. Where we aren't the same is we don't do a lot of the technical level rescues. Like we don't do, for example, we don't do technician level hazmat. The cost to do that is, like a lot of city departments don't even do that. The cost is so high. Trench rescue, to get air shores and all of the strong backs and all of the equipment that we would need, it's just for the amount of, we'll call for support for those type of calls because they're incredibly rare. We'll stabilize. We're trained at awareness level, so nobody else gets in trouble, and we don't get in trouble, but we'll bring the experts in from there. So, yeah, great question. Yes.
Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I did want to ask a question, but I did want to say I have been to your firehouse in New Hamburg. I've met your firefighters. True community servers is what they are and what they do. So impressed with them. So impressed that they step up all the time to do this. They don't have to. So kudos to them and kudos to you for leading them. What I did want to ask is because obviously you know that we have senior we have Foxborough and Morningside and Stonecroft. Do you plan or do you go out to them? I know that each of those typically has a weekly coffee time or a weekly get-together to share some of that information with some of our elderly.
Through the chair, yes, we do. Our public educator does that. She's currently developing all kinds of relationships with all those groups. I can't give you any specific dates or times that that's occurred, but I know it does occur. What I would like to do, excuse me, at some point in time, typically a fire department will do a year-end report to council, and that's when they would have the opportunity then to present those type of statistics. So you would see how many engagements with our senior community or with Stonecroft, Foxborough, Morningside, et cetera, et cetera. You know, how many, did they go to the Legion and do a talk? Did they engage with how many schools? We have a lot of schools in our municipality. All of those things. So we're compiling that data now so that at some point in time we can share that data with council.
We will go to Councillor Cressman first and then a follow-up to Councillor Martin.
I guess, excuse me, through you, Mayor, I have two questions. The first relates specifically to grain bin extractions, and I know of at least two that have happened in the township, you know, over an extended period of time. Is that something you're equipped to do, or do you have to rely on others to come in and do that? And by what I mean is, somebody enters the grain bin, the grain is moving out, and they become trapped, and it's like quicksand, and there's a period of time that they have available to extract before it's too late. So is that something that we have training on, or is that something we would rely on a budding mutual aid situation?
Through the chair, we do not have the capability to deliver that type of a rescue service. We would call in someone. Unfortunately, there's specialized equipment to do grain rescue now, and to access that equipment is not easy. I think the farm safety group is who tries to educate our farming community on those type of, well, there's a significant list of hazards on a farm, but their job is to try and educate the farming community to try to keep them out of those situations. But no, we do not have a rescue capability. And I'm not even sure of anyone, even locally, that would be able to deliver that.
A second question. Having just gone through a change in insurance companies for my farm insurance, is there a connection between the underwriting that an insurance company would do on a facility, because often they're out there looking at the potential hazards and assess risks at a specific farm, and then does that somehow feed back to the local fire department? I know we're all encouraged to have a risk and a plan that's accessible in case of a fire, so that the local fire department would come and immediately they would know where significant hazards are, etc. Is that something that relies on the farm owner, or is that, you know, does the fire, the insurer provide some of that information, or is it strictly through the farm community that has to pass on to the local department?
Through Madam Chair, it would be the farmer that would have to provide us that information. We do some pre-planning on some of the large barns. We've had one particular barn that has had a couple of fires, and we're quite familiar with it. And so we look at, and a lot of those barns are similar in size and nature, so we can use that as a footprint to determine how we would deal with future events. But yes, the farming community would have to share those documents if they have them, and then we could put that in our pre-plan system.
Councillor Martin?
Through you, Mayor Salen, I was curious about the cost recovery. In a flooding situation, if somebody takes a joyride, seeing how far they can get in the high water and get stuck, and then there has to be a call fired, which I witnessed this past, I don't know, February or whenever there was a flood. Is that the kind of thing that you do cost recovery on? The examples you gave were on the marijuana grow-op situation, but I was curious about things like that.
Yeah, through the chair. Yes, we could bill for that. I'll give you a more recent example. CN Rail comes through town, lights up a grass fire, forces us to go. A property owner now has, a fire on their property. We go, we extinguish the fire, and we send CN Rail a bill and it's an MTO rate. So the Ministry of Transportation determines a rate for fire apparatus per fire apparatus, and then I have a rate per firefighter. And then we could also charge, if equipment's damaged, if we had to use firefighting foam. There's a whole variety. If we had to get an excavator in from a company, we would it's cost recovery. We don't profit from those things, but we certainly do recover the cost.
Any additional questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none. Oh, Councillor Cressman.
Yes, through you, Mayor. I guess in your presentation, it would appear to me to rely on your expertise as fire chief to a great extent in putting a plan together. And I'm, given the same circumstances, obviously I would think there would be some variation in assessing risk, plans, etc. Or are they fairly well aligned between municipality A and municipality B and municipality C, if they all had similar risks, etc.?
Through the chair, that's an interesting question. It's actually a really good question, because if we compare our 4 municipalities that we're all surrounded and connected, we're all vastly different. For example, Woolwich has a chemical valley. We don't. If you get into Wellesley, they're mostly a Mennonite area in the farming community, but they have all kinds of small industries on the properties. That's another example. We don't have a 401, we have a Highway 7 and 8. So if you go to North Dumfries, they got the 401. It's a different animal than our 7 and 8 is. There are still similar risks, but again, it's just, we're so different than each other that when you do your community risk assessment, our community risk assessments are vastly different. I can tell you that we have, North Dumfries has the highest medium risk properties from the province off their risk assessment, and we're next in line, even over Woolwich or Wellesley. So, and that's medium. No, we have no high risk in our community, thankfully. That's a whole other discussion. But Woolwich would have a couple of high risk where, and they deal with those things accordingly. So, and again, I'm not familiar with those townships intimately. I don't follow that. That's not my job, is to look after our community.
Any other questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much, Chief, for coming this evening and bringing that forward. And I know it was quite the effort to get the time down, but I think it was definitely useful, so thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
You did really good. Under an hour with questions as well. So, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Chief. And now I will give a moment for Greg to get his presentation up, and it's going to be, yes, our Director of Corporate Services and CFO, Greg Clark, is going to be doing some municipal finance educational component. Just for sake, so that everybody's aware, we'll do questions at the end again. So if you can just save those for when he's finished his presentation. And thank you for joining us, Greg.
So, thank you, Council, for There we go. Thank you, Council, for having me tonight. This presentation stems from budget. We had the conversation at budget about Finance 101 and an education session, and so here I am tonight to talk Municipal Finance 101. And as the Mayor mentioned at the beginning, the intention here is not to delve into the specific situation of our township, but really keep it at a high level about how municipal finance works, the different parts, how they interact, approvals, authorities, reporting, those types of things. And when we come back in September, pre-budget, we can delve into the areas where we're doing well, the areas where we need to improve, and how some of those things can be achieved. So tonight, what I'm going to go through is pretty basic, pretty straightforward in terms of terminology, but hopefully, somebody told me once, a good education session, at least you leave with one or two things you didn't know when you came in. So I'm hoping that in the next hour you take away at least one or two things that you didn't know, and then that's been worthwhile. So we're going to go over the Municipal Act because we are creatures of the province, and so everything we do and the reason we exist is because of the Municipal Act. We'll cover the operating budget, reserves and reserve funds, capital budget, and how it relates to those, and then get into a bit of long-term planning at a very high level and how that ties those three items together. So, like I said, Municipal Act is a piece of legislation which outlines everything that we do, numerous sections, including a couple that relate specifically to finance and budget as it relates to our operation. So, the first one is the role of the treasurer, so it's pretty wide-ranging in terms of collecting all the money payable, depositing funds, paying all the debts and expenditures, keep accurate records, and report to council and invest the funds. So one short sentence with a lot of things going in there, and I don't say that I do all of that. I have a team that helps me, but really that's the core function of the Treasury within a municipality, is that we are the central hub that everything flows through, whether it's taxation collection, paying of debentures, paying of expenses, compensation, keeping those records, reporting on those things to council, and then obviously investing funds. So that's laid out in the Municipal Act that is the responsibility of the treasurer, and so that ultimately falls on me. Annually, we have to approve an operating budget and a capital budget, and so we have to approve the expenditures within those budgets, as well as the levy that allows us to collect property taxation, as well as fees and charges related to other revenues. One of the things that's come up and a number of times confuses council a little bit, or members of the public, is the difference between the way that we report our financial statements and the way we prepare our budget. So when we prepare our budget, it's on what's called a modified accrual basis, in that there's certain items we exclude, and then we focus more on a cash basis for those items. So the number one example in our situation is depreciation expense related to capital items. So we don't budget for that in our annual budget. What we budget for is transfer to reserves. But when we flip over to the financial statements and those are presented to you, that transfer of reserves is not considered, and then instead you have a depreciation expense. So there's a PSAB requirement that legislates that difference. And so when we say a balanced budget, it's really balanced on that cash basis, so that everything that we collect revenue for during the year, we have a current year expenditure for that. From the PSAB perspective or the financial statement perspective, there is no requirement for it to be balanced. It's to reflect truly and accurately from an accounting perspective how we did. And so that is one of the key differences when you talk about a balanced budget. So when we get into the operating budget, like I mentioned, we have lots of different expenses. Some of them are, discretionary. Some of them are put in place tied to service. Some of them are put in place and committed to for long periods of time. So most municipalities, compensation makes up about 70 to 80% of our budget. In many municipalities, we have collective bargaining agreements that lay out how we pay our employees. At Wilmot, we do not have that. We have a completely non-unionized workforce, which gives us a little bit more flexibility from a compensation perspective, but also gives us sort of a bit of uncertainty because we don't have 3 and 4 year collective agreements. So each year it's a bit more year by year, council makes those decisions. Goods and services typically relate to whether it's chemicals and materials that we buy for the rec center to treat the water in the pool, to roads materials, to contracted services to carry out small projects throughout the year, to undertake surveying, assessments of infrastructure, those types of things. Utilities, just like any business, we face utility impacts, and one of the biggest challenges we have, like anybody else, is forecasting where rates are going to go. So currently this year, there's been a little bit more volatility in utilities because of what's happened south of the border, but we are managing those within our budget. Debt typically is a funding, not a funding tool, but a financing tool. But once we enter into it, we have to budget for it. And then that transfer to reserve funds, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So typically municipalities, in the way that we balance our budget, is we have a set of expenses which represent real costs and real current expenditures, and then we have a number of revenues which are forecasted on actual real in-year revenues. And then the difference between those is transfers to and from reserves. And so the more we budget to put towards capital, the bigger that difference is and the bigger we're transferring in there, but it has to be a conscious decision, because that gap, that transfer to reserves, won't grow just on its own. It has to be budgeted for. So it's not something like compensation or utilities where there's an indexing built into the cost of labor or the cost of utilities that drives up our costs each year. Transfer to reserves is something that's intentional through strategies similar to what we discussed at budget, where we're increasing transfers to capital reserves. Similarly, there's opportunities to fund things in year within our operating budget from reserve funds. So one-time items. So perfect example is the election coming up next year. We will fund that one time from a reserve that's been set up specifically to allow us to smooth that out. So we put money in the 3 non-election years, we pull money out in the election year. So that transfer to reserves really functions as a smoothing mechanism. It allows us to put money away for future costs. It allows us to take money out when it's needed. And really, while it doesn't represent a specific cost in a year, it does serve a significant purpose in helping us manage our year-over-year increase in budget via that transfer to reserves or transfer from. Revenues, as a lower-tier municipality, we have similar revenues as to any other municipality. We just have less services, so we have less user fees, but we still have the major ones of property tax, water and wastewater rates, which account for probably close to 80% of our revenue, the balance coming from user fees such as the rec center. We do collect money for permit fees, fines, and penalties, and those add to offsetting a number of our costs, whether it's in finance, planning, building, those types of areas where we try to do cost recovery. And we're looking at, those are areas where we can look at offsetting costs on the tax base to putting them more on a user base. So looking at our fees and charges bylaw and looking at opportunities to collect direct from users. And that is one area that a lot of municipalities are looking into, is are they charging the right user fees? Are they charging the right people for those services that aren't community-wide but are more specific to the user? The next item, this is something I've been preaching since I started in municipal, is that variances are not good or bad. They are. It's how they ended up to be and what we do about them which makes them good or bad. So a variance that comes out of nowhere that you didn't know was coming is typically a bad one because it means you weren't paying attention. A negative variance, where you've overpaid for something or under-recovered, could be for a legitimate reason. Something like an unexpected snow event, for example. We plan for a certain number of snow events, and if we have one more than expected, we're going to have more higher costs. Revenues. We have an unexpected pool closure for a period of time during the summer, we're going to have less than expected revenue. Those variances are expected to occur. We can't predict budget with 100% accuracy. I used to say when I was working with departments, if your budget's 100% accurate, you're probably lying because you're doing it after the fact. You should be, having some variance in your budget, and that's expected. What you're supposed to be doing and what we should be doing is looking for those places where we're having variances. So I mentioned utilities. That's one area where we're trying to look at projecting out over the year. what might the variance be there if things continue, or what would it take to offset that. Those are the ways that you mitigate and turn a bad variance into something that's managed. And so the way that we address it, the way we identify it, and the way we control it is the critical part. And then the last point there, within control and outside control. Like I said, a snow event is something that's outside of our control. We can't choose to not go clear the snow. There's ministry regulations that require us to respond. However, there might be situations where, due to unforeseen costs, a particular service is running over budget, and we could make a decision to pause the service earlier in the year, shut down the program, make decisions to mitigate a cost. So it's all about whether we actually have control over those expenses or not. And one of the things that we need to continue to enhance is looking at those ways that we can control more of our variances. So how do we gain control over the inputs into those variances, and how do we get better at bringing them within our control? And when they're outside our control, how do we better manage to mitigate those through reserves and other contingencies so that we don't get caught offside? And then the last item on the operating budget, annual surplus and deficit. So end of July, we'll be bringing the year-end report with the annual surplus. And I did say surplus on purpose because it is a surplus this year. It's not big, but it's there. And so, surpluses can be caused by a number of things. Revenue over and above expected. And we'll give Chris some due when we get there. Rec came in with a lot of revenue this year, and I think, we saw that through the budget. We're budgeting for more, but in 2024, it's given us a bit of a surplus, or it could be under spending in other areas, and we have had some line items where expenses are under typical. And so when we present that annual surplus, it's not just the bottom line that we really want to look at. We want to look at what of those things are sustainable, and what of those things were just really great and they happened and it made us have a surplus, but better not bet on that for the future, because if it goes the other way, we're in trouble. And so that's one of the critical things as we prepare the budget. We want to look at those things and say, how likely is that to occur again in the future? How likely is it that we're going to have higher than expected revenue? And I think that's part of the conversation we had at budget. There's a certain level of confidence we have, and so let's budget for that. But beyond that, we have to be cautious. And the same thing on the expense side. We don't want to expect that our expenses are going to run at a very low inflationary rate. We have to address, outside pressures. And so ultimately, the other piece, and this came about through the 2024 budget, we set up a operating contingency reserve, which enables us to deal with those unexpected blips. And so we have a contingency reserve of roughly $600,000, which is not a huge amount of money, but where we were and where we are now, it's a really good start. It gives us the opportunity to mitigate things in year if something comes up, something unexpected. It gives us the opportunity at the end of the year to not have to carry a deficit into the next year. It allows us to do better planning. It allows us to be, I don't want to, a little less risk averse. So the better contingencies you have, the more risk you can take, because now I've got a pocket of money, and if that revenue doesn't materialize, I've got that contingency. Or if expense goes a little bit faster than I expected, now I've got that contingency. So having that contingency, while it may be money that's sitting idle, it gives us the ability to sharpen our pencils and really draw those numbers tighter, and really limit the year-over-year budget increases, and really not have to put the contingency within the budget, but leave the contingency in the reserve. So that's the importance of a contingency reserve, is you hope to never use it, but it allows you to be a little bit less risk averse and take on a few more opportunities and try a few more things out, as well as things like pilot projects, opportunities that come out of nowhere from a provincial or federal government that wants to get something done. It acts as that pool of money that allows you to capitalize on those things. So, before I go into capital, yes, I forgot. I almost forgot about the most important part of the operating budget, assessment. So hopefully this is something that can help everybody understand assessment a little bit better. So during our budget deliberation, we talked about assessment, and a number of the public brought up how changes in assessment impacts their tax bills. And if we were to go out and do a reassessment, that would make their taxes go up. And this is intended to be a very simple explanation of assessment. It is a very complex thing. It's why we have MPAC, which is the provincial body that does all the assessment. But at the heart of it, they're responsible for assessing every property in the province. They provide that assessment to us annually. Any changes within the year, they provide us as they occur. So as new homes get built, we get notified, they get added to next year's roll. Somebody goes out and puts an addition on, that gets added to their property, we get notified, it gets added to the roll. So that is MPAC's job. That is not our job. We don't chase assessment. Some bigger municipalities are a little more proactive because they have bigger departments and they might prod MPAC along on certain bigger files and different things to help the process. We don't have that capability, and it really wouldn't be a worthwhile adventure for us because it's not a significant amount of revenue to offset the effort. But at the end of the day, MPAC brings the assessment role to us. It has not been reassessed since 2016, so everything is 2016 valuation. So if your house, if you paid, $750,000 for it, and your assessment roll says it's worth $350,000, you didn't lose $400,000. It's just they're using 2016 valuations on every property, even ones that are being built today. That is the basis currently for assessment. There's constant conversations around reassessment that go on between finance, MFOA, the ministry, and that. I'm not really 100% sure where it's at right now. I know the province has talked about it. I'm not sure if they're planning on it or anything like that, but as we find out more, we will share with council. But ultimately, the important part to remember is that a reassessment does not add tax revenue to the municipality. So if our assessment roll were to be reevaluated, so they did a reassessment and everybody's property doubled in value by assessment, we wouldn't gain any tax revenue because everything would be adjusted so that you'd still say, so that the total net taxes collected would still be the same. What may happen is reassessment could impact one property versus another. So if certain areas assessment goes up faster than others, then certain properties could see a shift in their relative taxation. So that's the key thing to remember about assessment, is that we as a township don't benefit from a reassessment on our existing roll. What it does do is, as new properties come on, it gives us a better reflection of current assessment, it gives us a better reflection of current development, it gives us a better estimate of where that value is being driven from. So it does give us better information and better taxation. It's just the actual act of reassessing doesn't change our revenues. But it does have an impact on residents, and so some will see their taxes go up and some will see their taxes go down because of a reassessment province-wide. The biggest thing that impacts who we tax within the township is the tax ratios. So every year council approves our tax rates and our tax ratios, and that's where we establish the ratio of a residential property is considered a 1, and then everything is a multiple of that. So farm is set at a maximum of 25%. So farmland is 25% of our residential rate. Commercial is roughly 1.9 of a residential. So those ratios establish how much you pay based on your assessment. So that simplified calculation at the bottom there basically says once council establishes a tax rate, then you take your assessment and your tax class ratio, and that gives you your taxes payable. So for 90% of our population, our taxpayers, that's residential taxes. That's how they're paying. So it's a 1. That tax class doesn't impact. But for our commercial, for our industrial, for farm, for some of our multi-res, it does have an impact. And so that's why that class ratio is so important. It establishes how that multiplier works for those different classes and then determines who actually pays what within those other classes. Like I mentioned, farm is set by the province. There's a couple of ratios that are classes that are set by the province. A number of them, we have some flexibility, but they're capped. I don't think our ratios have been reviewed in a while, if I'm correct. I went looking back and they've been pretty static. It is something that can be looked at, but it's not necessarily something that's looked at from a revenue perspective. It's more looked at from a fairness perspective. So are we treating each class fair? And so what I can say to that end is our ratios are in line with all of the rest of the lower tiers within the region, so we're not outside of the norm of what everybody else's tax ratios are. But if that were something council wanted to look at, that could be a project that could be undertaken and could be assessed to make sure we're not outside of the norm and impacting either competitiveness or fairness on some of those multipliers. So now we'll go to reserves. So it's a nice picture of a bunch of gold bars, but that's not necessarily what our reserves look like, as we all know. So I just thought I'd put some optimism in there. So these definitions are right out of the Municipal Act. So reserves, they're basically a savings account that has no reference to a specific asset or a future obligation. So you can think of a reserve as Canada Day. We could have a reserve set up. People give us donations. People give us funds. We put $50,000 in the reserve. That reserve is set there to fund Canada Day activities. It may have money in it, may not have money in it. Council uses it from day to day or from year to year to fund the activities. But it's not really a long-term strategy to fund anything. They don't earn interest. They don't require to be segregated. There's a little bit more flexibility there. Reserve funds, on the other hand, are established with a purpose in mind. So whether it's a capital reserve fund, a long-term strategy to fund some type of initiatives over multiple years, they're set up with the intention of funding a specific long-term strategy, investments in assets, investments in long-term development of the organization. They earn interest. They're generally somewhat segregated in that there is a bit more control and council has to make more of an intention to use them. They're typically used for, can't be used for the purpose other than what they were established, whereas a reserve, you might change the purpose because Canada Day is no longer an event, so we're just going to pick up those funds and use them for something else. A reserve fund typically doesn't have that situation because there's an ongoing need. And then the last two pieces, obligatory versus discretionary. So discretionary means that within council's discretion, you could choose to use capital funding from one reserve to fund capital of a different type, if you so choose. Obligatory are established by statute, and so we have a couple of them. We have the Ontario Building Code establishes a reserve fund that is set up to manage building operations, and so any excesses or deficits are funded in and out of that. The same goes for provincial funding related to OSIF and federal gas tax from the federal government, as well as development charges. So they're all considered segregated in that they're not our income, they're not our revenue until we've earned it. So the idea is that while the province or a developer may have given us cash as payment of a development charge or transfer via grant, those funds sit in there until they're used for an approved purpose, and then at that point we bring them into our revenue stream. Discretionary reserves are built from our own surpluses, so after we've earned the income we put it in there. So it's one key thing to remember, because as we talk about financial statements, that distinction on the obligatory reserves has a huge impact on our financial statements, because as we draw money out of those, we get a revenue. So for example, we build a $10 million sewer pipe and we use development charges. In the year we build it, we'll recognize $10 million in revenue. But that's really not an ongoing annual revenue. It's just revenue because we finally built the project and took the money out. So obligatory reserves are generally big in scale, so you generally have a fair bit of money in them. They usually sit there and accumulate funds, and then you use them periodically to do major investments through capital programs. So they're an important funding mechanism, but they are, like I say, tied to specific uses. And one of the things I also want to highlight is that through the budget, we made a change in how we allocate interest, and so part of it was driving from this, that the reserve funds should be earning interest based on actual balance, not budgeted balance. So whatever's in them from an actual perspective at the beginning and end of the year, that should indicate how much interest they get. And so when you see this, the financial report this year, you'll see how much interest was transferred to our reserves. Is significantly more than in the past, which is a good thing. It allows for that long-term accumulation of funds to pay for future needs. And now we'll get into the capital budget. That's not a picture of our streets, but it was one of the nicest ones Canada had. Obviously, you know, I could bike down that path and not worry about getting hit by a car like I do in Kitchener. But anyways, that's besides the man. So, types of capital. There's 3 types of capital we have, generally speaking. Infrastructure renewal, so replacing assets we already own. So we own a lot of assets, several hundred million, water, wastewater, the WRC. We have to replace those. And so that's typically referred to as infrastructure renewal. Growth, building new assets to support new residents and businesses. So typically development charges is our #1 source of funding for those types of assets. However, with changes in the DC legislation, there is a larger portion of that falling on the tax and rate basis. But basically, we're building new assets to provide the same level of service to new people. And then service enhancement, and this is when we're looking at adding or expanding an existing service. So I'll use an example of, we have an existing park and, you know, it's providing a great level of service, but we decide we're going to put in a washroom and change room because there's a splash pad there, and so we want that enhanced amenity. That's not really growth, it's just enhancing the service at the park. So it's making it a better experience for the community, and so typically that's paid for by current residents and not through development charges. So while it's a growth in our number of assets, it's really a service enhancement. Like I mentioned, sources of funding, tax and user fees are our primary ones, and then we have development charges through the development charge study and grants. And I know we had an announcement today, pretty exciting. We're getting some money from the province to help out with one of our projects. And so grants fall into 2 distinct sort of buckets. We have annual allocation grants like OSIF and Canada Community Building Fund, which are allocation based on certain metrics. OSIF is based on the value of our existing assets. CCBF is based on population and the amount of revenue that the federal government is collecting, and then they're allocated out to every municipality across the province or across the country. Other grants like the one today are application-based, where we're competing with other municipalities for a limited supply of funds, and we put in our best effort to get those funds, and it helps us offset either an existing project or a future project based on the criteria that the province or federal governments set out. So typically in my time in municipal government, there's been a big shift from dedicated annual allotments to application-based grants, which in some ways makes sense that, you know, we're having to argue and articulate why we need that funding for that specific use. However, it has made long-term planning a little more difficult because now you don't know which programs are going to be available next year, whether you're going to get the funding, how much is going to be available. So it makes long-term planning a little bit more difficult. The other form of funding where we're just giving an allocation annually does allow for a little bit more stability, but there are benefits to the application base, because you might be able to get larger sums for one-time events that you wouldn't be able to get under an allocation base. So something like we're going to be applying for Petersburg. Council saw that report earlier in the month. That typically, you know, would be beyond our annual allocation, but if we can apply and get that as a one-time funding, it's a huge opportunity. So one other thing you'll notice on here is that I haven't listed debt. Debt is not a funding source, it is a financing tool. So you'll see projects funded from debt, but that debt has to be paid for from somewhere else. So that debt is either paid for from development charges, from taxes, from user fees. So ultimately, taxes, user fees, or debt are really the funding source, and the debt is just allowing you to pay it over a period of time. So it's a really important thing to remember that while debt allows us to do a project sooner than the future, just like a homeowner, you have to pay that debt back. And so, you know, prudent use of debt to finance and bring projects forward is critical, because it is not a funding source. It does not create money. It simply allows us to shift things in time and give us, you know, the ability to do bigger projects, possibly at a sooner timeline. The next item, operating impacts from capital. We didn't get into a lot of that this year during the budget, but it is something that we're going to be, you know, municipalities are starting to get more and more sophisticated in estimating. And an example is you put in a brand new park, so it's 100% development charge funded because it's a growth park, it's in a new subdivision. That's great, the development charge is paid for it. But next year, we now need a team of 2 guys to go out and mow it, and then we need to, replace plants in the spring that die, and we need to, cut down a tree and put in a new tree, or we need to fix the swings because they got vandalized. All those costs fall on the municipality, and if we don't plan for that when we build the project, it becomes a real pressure on an annual basis. So what a lot of municipalities are moving towards is when you approve the capital project, you also agree to the operating budget. So you may not approve it in that year, but you agree that within a year or two or the year after construction, that a set amount will be approved for the operating of that asset. And that could include not just things like I mentioned, staff, but also, your overhead costs. It could include your replacement and renewal costs, depending on the type of asset. So it's getting more and more robust, and it's getting more widespread. And really, at the heart of it, when you talk about infrastructure deficit that we've accumulated, part of it is because we haven't planned for that cost of capital down the road, or that cost of owning that asset. So operating impacts from capital is something that municipalities are really starting to push and trying to move forward. And then the last thing, we talked about this at budget, and I'll reiterate it again, deferring capital, whether it be infrastructure renewal or growth, doesn't make it go away. It simply means that it's required in a future time period. Service enhancements, yes, you could say I'm not going to do that in service enhancement, and you could make it go away. Infrastructure renewal, you've already got the pipes. Unless you're going to decommission something and not replace it, the need to renew it is going to be there. Growth, as long as that growth is forecasted to come, and as long as those homes are being built and those businesses are being built, you're going to need to build that growth infrastructure at some point in time. And so when we're talking about capital, it's not a one-year decision in the sense that you do it or don't do it. In the operating budget, if you don't do a program this year, say we don't offer some new program out at the rec center, then that operating cost for this year just goes away, and we don't have it next year. But if we don't renew the roof at the rec center, next year we still have to renew it. So it's an important distinction between operating and capital. The decisions we make in capital are long lasting. Operating can have impacts, obviously, in level of service and condition of facilities, but it's not as cumulative as a deferred capital project. So long-term planning. So how does it all fit together? So I heard Councillor Gressman mention the bathtub. I can't take credit for the graphic because I'm not that talented, but a few years ago when I was at the City of Guelph, we came up with this idea of a bathtub, and one of our great communications people put this little graphic together, and Brett helped me clean it up and reuse it here. But I think it's a very simple way to explain how these 3 things work together. If you think about the annual operating budget as your faucet, it's what brings your revenue in to your bathtub every year. So you're trying to make that predictable, consistent. You don't want it turned on and off. You don't want it to have a shock to the system. You want that nice, steady flow of water into the tub. Then your operating expenses that you pay out annually and your transfers to reserve and payment of debt comes out of your tub. So at the end of the day, you don't ever want the tub to be too shallow, but you also don't want it overflowing with water. So you don't want the tap running so fast that the money's just flowing everywhere. You want it to stay at a nice, even level. But knowing that you've got bigger years for capital and smaller years, that bucket comes in, and sometimes it's going to draw a little bit more water out. Your level's going to go down. You might have to hold off on capital while the bathtub fills back up. And so keeping that in mind helps us keep an idea of there has to be a consistency and a long-term vision to not just what our annual operating is, but how we're using those funds on an annual basis. Where are they going? Are they going to reserves? Are they going to annual operating? Is our capital pulling so much water out that bathtub's going to be empty in 2 years? If it is, then we have to look at, the other 2. Do we need more money, more water flowing in? Do we need to cut back on operating expenses? Are we not moving enough to reserve funds? So it's trying to find that good balance where there's enough water in the tub that you're not seeing the bottom, but like I say, it's not overflowing the top and being wasteful of the water. So we want to keep that tub at a nice even level all the time. And so when we talk about multi-year operating budgets, so it should reflect master plans, official plans, strategic plans, things that have been approved by council. It should project out the annual cost of implementing those ideas. And the critical thing is the pace at which we want to implement those is what dictates the rate at which expenses and revenues increase. So it's great to say we have a master plan, and it's a 10-year master plan. But if we want to implement that in 10 years, then that dictates a certain pace of growth in expenses and revenues. If we're happy to implement that 10-year master plan over 20 years, then we get a lower rate of revenue and expenses. But if we want to speed it up and we want it all done next year, that's going to cost a different rate of investment. So the treasurer at Wealth, Tara Baker, she was very big in sharing this with council, that the pace at which we implement these things dictates how our annual operating budget is impacted. So if we have a lot of great ideas and a lot of great plans and a lot of great stuff comes forward to council and we want to do it all at once, it's going to cost more. But if we want to measure it out and do it over a period of time, then it becomes a little bit more reasonable in terms of the annual increases. But that's really where council has that opportunity to say, I like these things, but I want to do them in this order at this pace. And that's really where council and the mayor has that opportunity to, take those pieces and put them in order and put them in the priorities that they come forward. We've had talks about multi-year budgets. A number of municipalities approve multi-year budgets. Typically, a good multi-year budget isn't just an indexing of costs and revenues. It actually is a reflection of those items over multiple years. And it gives you a sense of how fast you can accomplish things given a set of parameters that you want to accomplish. One thing to remember, though, is that the annual confirmation of the budget is still required. So in Ontario, we're not allowed to approve a budget for more than 1 year. We can endorse and approve a multi-year, but annually that confirmation of the budget still comes back and must be approved through the mechanisms laid out in the Municipal Act. The capital forecast incorporates things like asset management on top of those master plans and official plans and a strategic plan. It lays in all of that infrastructure renewal. A good asset management plan hopefully goes out 25 to 50 years, identifies major infrastructure needs, major peaks and valleys within that plan, and then helps us build a capital budget that is achievable over a short period of time as well as sustainable over the long period of time. And so this is that timing piece that I talked about. You can't defer capital forever, so you have to establish a timing. And so the capital forecast is your tool for identifying that timing. And ideally, we're replacing assets before end of life, and we're getting to them. I had a city engineer one time say to me, the best asset management plan, nobody ever knows you're doing it. Because they're not complaining about potholes. They're not complaining about community centers being closed. They're not complaining about leaks in the roof, because you're getting to it. You're getting it fixed. You're renewing it. You're replacing it. It's happening. Nobody notices, and everything's great. I would say that's aspirational for most municipalities, but I think that's sort of the mindset we have to also look at, is why it's important to do preventative maintenance, to get to these things early. Is if we do them, then people don't notice a disruption in their service, and they feel like they're getting good value. So it's really important that we put those plans together, and obviously investing in a renewal and updated of our asset management plan is very important, as well as bringing a 10-year capital that's fully funded. And then reserve fund and debt forecasts. So they demonstrate sustainability of capital forecasts. So it's great to have a 10-year capital plan, but if it's not aligned with the reserve fund and debt forecast, then it's difficult to know whether it's funded or how it's going to impact the long-term sustainability. So they go hand in hand. If you have a 10-year capital forecast, you need a 10-year debt forecast and a 10-year reserve forecast. And those are all based on your multi-year operating budget. So when those three align, then you can establish how sustainable you are. Are you actually going to be able to achieve those things over the next 10 years? Or are we constantly going to be reworking the model year after year after year because we haven't built that long-term sustainability? So that's where long-term planning comes together, is it's the intersection of those three, and that they all align, they all total up. There's no gaps, there's no mystery, unknown funding items. It's all thought out and put together. So, one last thing I wanted to just touch on is how some of this relates to strong mayors. And really, at the end of the day, none of this foundationally changes because of strong mayors. So that's the important part to remember here. Like, we are going to go through a budget process. We're going to come into this. We're going to work at this. Municipal Finance 101 is still there. It's still there. Council has their role to play with the mayor. It's just a slightly different dynamic of how the budget's going to be presented. So I think, as we go through the budget, all of these core principles are still going to be the center of what the mayor brings forward, are still going to be the core of what's presented to you. I know Strong Mayors is going to make our process different, and I don't really want to get into all that tonight. We'll talk about that hopefully later in the month, but I just did want to touch on that because I didn't cover it here, but ultimately, none of this changes under Strong Mayors. None of this is any different under Strong Mayors. It's exactly the same process, the exact same goals. It's just some different mechanisms on how we go through the budget deliberations and approval. That's really the only thing that changes through that. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Director Clark. I will go to Councillor Dunstall for questions first.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Thank you, CFO. Two questions. You discussed variances at the beginning of your presentation, and I was wondering, when we're looking at building our budget, do you build in a variance contingency, and at what rate?
Yes. So there are certain items that we know are not going to be 100%. Compensation is the number one. So we know that we're going to have turnover. We know that not everybody's at top of grid payment-wise. We know that not all of our benefits are going to be for families. We're going to have some individuals. We know that a number of things are going to impact our compensation to bring us from 100% budget down to some lower number. So typically we would look at history and say, okay, we have a turnover rate of 5%. We have a gap from top of grid to normal of 8%, and we have a benefit gap of 3.5%. So then we take that, and that's what we implemented this year in what we call compensation gapping. So we look at what is that number on average over a period of time, and then that allows us to still budget for the full complement that we need, and everybody's still got their full complement of staff. But what it's saying is, overall across the organization, we expect X dollars to not be spent out of our compensation lines. Some departments may have a bigger realized gap than others, so some may not realize that gap, others may. The goal is to manage it across the organization. So it's not like we're going to say, well, you've got to lay off staff for 3 months because we didn't meet our gapping target. It's really about looking at it across the organization and making sure that we're within our targets. And typically we set it fairly conservatively this year with the goal of sort of moving it up as we get better experience and reducing that amount of variance. So hopefully, it all, not hopefully, I'm confident it's all going to work out. I've been reviewing to the end of June, and right now we're trending very well on that one. Other items that we might have variance on, we might put things like contingency. So a council in 2024 approved a contingency amount to set aside funds both for the CAO and for the mayor and council to use. That's the other place where you're putting in funds that aren't allocated for a specific purpose, and so you've put those in. So typically you'll see in organizations things like temporary staffing. So you might have a temporary staffing item that says, if I need to do some work in the year, I've got $15,000 to hire temp staff. You may have a contingency for contracted services, so I need to get a consultant in to do a study. I've got $15,000. Those types of items do exist in a lot of municipalities' budgets. We don't we don't have those other than that one contingency item. So we don't have contingency built in within our budgets. It's very much the numbers you see are budgeted against actual experience and actual expenses other than compensation, which we've tried to transition. And really the focus is because compensation makes up 80% of our budget, so that's where we decided to focus first.
Thank you. Last question. For the reserve funds, one bucket or individual buckets?
There's a whole bunch of buckets. So I don't know off the top of my head, somewhere around 25 we have. So it all depends on the purpose. So for the development charges, they have to be segregated. So roads has to be separate from water, from wastewater, from that. Water and wastewater we keep separate. Tax, sometimes we blend them, sometimes we have them separate. It all depends on the purpose and what we're trying to accomplish with that reserve fund. So yeah, it can be a combination of different things. So.
Thank you.
Councillor Cressman?
Yes, through you, Mayor. Excellent presentation. A number of questions. I don't know if I had them. The contingency reserve, is there a percentage limit? I look at that as like retained earnings on my farm, and you like to have enough there for the rainy days and the unexpected. Can we accumulate a certain amount there? Is there provincial legislation that limits how much we can put in that slot?
No, there's no provincial regulation that limits how much we can have in reserves or reserve funds. There is best practice, though. So typically municipalities target 8 to 10% of their annual operating expenses within a contingency reserve. So that for us would be closer to $1 million. So we're at maybe 4 or 5%, not really the 8 to 10, but it's a good start. So when we bring the reserve report forward at the end of July, we'll have some of that rough estimates in there. But yeah, ideally you start to build a target, you start to establish parameters around how much you want in each of those reserves that establishes good practice.
Follow up for Councillor Cressman.
Yeah, second question through you, Mayor, relates to the assessment, and I understand the assessment haven't gone to enough luncheons. It was news to me that we can set our own ratio as a municipality. Is everybody residential ratio 1 and individual municipalities? And I think the provincial legislation determines farmland or farms are 25% of the one, are 25%, but commercial and business can be a different ratio by municipality. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, so each municipality has some flexibility. So if we wanted to get into, I didn't want to get too much down that path, but we could do a whole session just on ratios, and there's certain caps. So the farm one is a cap. There's a 25% cap. So municipalities have flexibility up to that cap, and then other of the different categories, and then certain categories are legislated that we have to have them. Certain categories are discretionary. We can decide to have them or not have them, and then we can establish those ratios based on the legislation. So that part of the Municipal Act is a whole big section, which I am beginning to get more familiar with. We had a great manager of taxation in Guelph, so he worried about all that. I just asked him questions if I had them, but I've got a great team. Emily and Sam know it much, much better than I am, but that is something as we start to go forward that if we want to review in more depth and look at options and opportunities, we can definitely do that, but it is a much more comprehensive.
One follow-up on that area specifically, mill rate. I've always looked at the mill rate, and I've assumed, rightly or wrongly, that if we went through a reassessment, because it's revenue neutral, it's adjusted. It just basically adjusts the mill rate. So yes. If our assessment as a pool in Wilmot Township goes up, and we don't generate any more revenue, then the mill rate has to fall to generate the same amount of money.
Yes, exactly, and that is exactly the function. The mill rate, which is a decimal number way down there, just gets adjusted to reflect the new assessment balance so that you get the same revenue number.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Mayor Salonen, and I also appreciated your presentation. Thank you, CFO Clark. I had a similar kind of question as Councillor Cressman because, you know, I have not fully understood why the MPAC assessment would mean that it's revenue neutral, but I think it's on this point that we're just talking about with the mill rate. So if my current tax rate might be $3,600 for the year on a house, and then the MPAC assessment doubles the assessment, I'm not going to be paying $7,800 next year on my tax. Is that correct? We just adjust then that tax rate? Or are the tax rate and the mill rate the exact same thing, or
Yes.
essentially?
Yeah, it's a historical term is mill rate. We call it the tax rate now, but it's interchangeable. You probably find them both in the Act. And to your point, across the township, it would be net zero. But you, for example, if your house got assessed at a bigger increase than your neighbors, well, somebody across town, wouldn't necessarily be your neighbor because it's more area rated than that, but somebody across town, then you might see your taxes go from 36 to 36.50 and somebody across town go from 36 to 35.50. So that's the nuance of the reassessment, but total revenue that the township brings in would still be the same exact amount as it was the year before.
Follow up.
Through you, Mayor Salonen. So then, So then if like, I remember somebody coming to council and talking about increased taxes based on renovations, or houses or properties may be assessed differently in terms of things that are done. And so if improvements are made, then they might be taxed higher based on that. But it's not that our tax rate goes up because of the assessment.
No, that's exactly correct. My personal experience, I built a workshop in my backyard. MPAC came in assessed it at $24,000. The city tacked that onto my current assessment, and now I pay taxes at that new assessed value because of the work I did. So it's the same thing. You do a renovation. Anytime you pull a building permit, MPAC is paying attention. They look at all of the building permits that go through, and that's where they get a lot of their impetus to come out and do assessment.
Any additional questions, councillors? Follow up again for Councillor Martin.
Through you, Mayor Salonen. So I was also curious about the operating impact. You were talking about how parks or other projects might be paid for by a developer or something. So for example, and I don't know if I'm going to use the Mike Scout wetlands, but if I shouldn't be specific, we can move away and make it more general. But if the Mike Scout wetlands were something that's paid for by a developer, but then the ongoing costs, we might have costs every year in terms of doing something to the boardwalk or doing something to work that has to be done. Or another park, I think we've got more parks coming up in terms of the developments that are coming up. So it's that's what you're talking about with the operating costs, or what was the word, operating impact, I guess.
Yeah, and to be clear, it could be from a project that we fully funded ourselves as well. It's not based on the source of funding. It's basically if it's adding something new that we have to do. So we've added it through the capital budget. We've paid for it. It's just that typically your sources of funding for that are development charges or things like assumed assets. Could be something donated. Could be a subdivision that's assumed where we've taken on pipes and roadway. Those types of things, we take them in through our capital budget and our capital plan, and we assume them and we now operate them, but we haven't really discussed them as part of the operating budget. And so that's where the critical piece comes in, is we need to take that eye to our capital budget and say, what of these things that we're doing are going to have an impact on our operations? And it could be a positive impact too. We could make changes where we've improved the efficiency of a building, or we've changed the layout of something that's made it more efficient. So it's both ways. It's definitely both ways. I don't want to make it seem like it's just typically the bigger impact is when you add stuff than when you modify stuff. The modify is around the edges. You add a whole park, that's a whole thing that you need to add. And so that is something that typically hasn't translated well from capital to operating, but we aim to do better.
Any additional questions at this time, councillors? Councillor Cressman.
Yes, through you, Mayor. I would think of a large capital project. I think of the rec center. People got their name and got recognized for, cash donations or whatever in raising funds, but, there is implications in operating, and that's the hidden cost over the long run. Nobody wants to make a donation to the annual operating cost of this, that, or the other thing, and having run and been responsible for research properties for the province, I well aware that people were talking about having their name associated with a big donation, but somebody had to pay for the annual operating cost of that year over year. So very much, I see your point, and I've seen it in practice. I had one other question in terms of the reserve, the user fee versus tax-based funding. And again, I circle back to a question I had when we were discussing budget, and when we have below ground infrastructure, sewers and water that need to be upgraded, I look at that and say I would be strongly in favor of having that come out of user fees, a fund or reserve fund built for end of life, or the roads I can understand being used by the entire township, but for those of us that have to fund our own wells and our own septic systems, I find it a bit of a challenge to understand my responsibility to fund upgrades for a service I can't receive. So are you aware of any, I'll put this nicely, are you aware of any municipalities that are able to generate user fee funds to renew their below ground infrastructure solely from user fee funds, or is that the goal of every municipality?
So that is actually the objective of the Clean Drinking Water Act, that water and wastewater must be, water predominantly is sustainable funding. And so the idea is that all of the infrastructure renewal, all of the renewal of those pipes must be funded from the users, and that sufficient charges being collected, on a per meter basis to develop those reserves. So we do have fairly good water and wastewater reserves, and they do fund the portion of projects that is related to the underground. So when you're renewing a water or wastewater system, we are going to those systems to pay for it. Where the tax piece comes in is that typically those pipes are underneath of a road, and so then you get into this combined funding, because we still have to put a road back. So depending on the approach that you take with that road, you may put more of the burden on water and wastewater. So if you're doing trenching, where all you're doing is cutting a 2 meter wide section out of the road, digging it up and putting a new pipe in, the water wastewater is going to pay for all of that, because they're leaving the road in a pretty horrible state. But if they're also benefiting in that the road is getting repaved and you're getting curbs and potentially better stormwater management, then it's reasonable that the taxpayers pay some of that. So that's part of what engineering works through, is who's actually benefiting from that reconstruction. And so we do try to consider that when we're budgeting for those projects, so that it's fair and reasonable, and that just because we're putting asphalt down doesn't mean it's 100% tax paid. It could be paid for the water and wastewater.
Councillor Martin?
Through you, Mayor Salonen, Councillor Cressman prompted another question I would have. The township is a registered charity, so people do get, if they make a donation to the township, they can get a charitable receipt. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So if somebody was feeling really generous and wanted to help out the township with millions of dollars in terms of our deficit, they could get a charitable receipt for that. Is that accurate?
I want to preface that I'd have to make sure it qualifies under the conditions that it's given and all those types of things. But yes, we are a registered charity that can give out receipts, and I actually got a call about this last week related to the castle. So yes, we do give out charitable receipts, but I don't want people feeling like their taxes get them a charitable receipt either. So you know, it has to be in the right setting, in the right situation to qualify for a charitable receipt. But yes, definitely something to be considered.
So if you're watching online and really want to contribute and get a tax receipt, your opportunities now.
Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions at this time, councillors? Okay, seeing none, thank you again very much, Director Clark. I didn't have any further announcements for this evening, but I will give the opportunity. Does anybody have any they'd like to add? Councillor Martin?
Yes, through you, Mayor Salonen. So thinking about Canada Day, I know you've mentioned Canada Day already, but just a reminder, that's coming up July 1st at the Normess Hill Park in New Hamburg. And there's a sunrise ceremony starting at 7 a.m. and beginning then at 1 p.m. are the opening ceremonies. You can come for cake that council will be cutting up and dividing out. There are vendors and booths, there's games, and then of course fireworks at night.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Dunstall?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor. The New Hamburg Board of Trade is sponsoring the History Food Walk. It's a historic walk through downtown. It'll be led by two of our historians, and they will be going to 5 different restaurants with stories about all of the different houses they pass. And that's this Sunday on the 22nd. Check out the New Hamburg Board of Trade for more detail. The Food and History Tour Walk. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other announcements now? Okay. Seeing none, we do have our confirmatory bylaw, and that is attached to the agenda to be read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed in open council. May I have a mover, please? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Dunstall. All those in favour? That carries unanimously. And adjournment. Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All in favour? That carries unanimously. Have a great night, and thank you again, everyone.